before I get started, I'd like you to let me know, do you have any thoughts or maybe insights on what you've been reading? I've read this book a couple times, and it always happens that I'm very grateful for reading it in different contexts, right? I think the last time I read it was maybe 10 years ago. And of course, we're in a completely different context. 10 years ago, I think this would have been, well, no, I know it was during the Obama administration. None of these topics that we're talking about here really impinged on me in my reading the way that they do now. This idea of that triumphalism of the oppressive governmental structures that keep people held at bay, healed, so to speak, HEELD. Um, so anyway, we've been talking about the role of the prophet. Of course, we talked about earlier Brueggemann's influences in this, and these are influences that become all the more clear as we get into the middle of or the first quarter of the 21st century. He At the time when he was writing this book, social scientific study of religion was just starting to uh, come into its own. And he was doing his study in a way that really didn't involve that perspective. It didn't involve that methodology, but nevertheless, there were touch points with that methodology. And as we talk about this, as we move forward, I'm going to mention some of these methodological issues that we're talking about here. But his reason for writing this book is not so much to give a kind of objective view of the prophets, but he is writing to ministers at the end of the 20th century, in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, uh, imploring, if you will, or at least encourage them to embark on a new kind of ministry that he calls prophetic ministry. In the past, it's always been so typical for people to start reading the Bible 2/3 of the way in, beginning with Matthew and ending with Revelation. They call themselves New Testament Christians. But I think Brueggemann helped all of us see that we cannot even begin to understand who Jesus was and what Jesus' inspiration was unless we get a clear sense of who the prophets were. And incidentally, I will be teaching beginning this Sunday. Damon called me up and said that their Sunday school person fell through for this Sunday. So I thought, what a perfect opportunity, because Greg will be preaching the narrative lectionary. Um, and that narrative lectionary is going to focus on the prophets. It's going to be Amos and then first Isaiah, and then we'll look at Jeremiah. Then all the way up through Advent, there will be a prophet whose scripture, the scripture will be coming from one of those prophets. And so if some of you come to the Sunday school class, I want you to know that this Sunday is going to be an introduction to those prophets that draws upon Brueggemann's work, this idea that a prophet must be one who criticizes and energizes, and placing it in the historical context of Moses and then later on King David. Now, you might remember that I better turn down my phone here. We're going to be interrupted. Sorry about that. You might remember on Sunday, one of the readings that no, I think it was the primary reading, was on the building of King Solomon Temple. So we're right smack dab in the middle of the triumphalism that eventually Israel is going to experience in the reigns of King David and King Solomon. But in the building of that temple, Solomon says, I'm building a temple to the name of God, and Greg emphasized this, trying to be as fair to Solomon as possible. I'm not as fair. I think Solomon really messed things up for us, but anyway, trying to be as fair to Solomon as possible. And that is, that no temple can hold who God is. God transcends any one place. Well, you can say that, but as Solomon's reign and the reign of many of the kings of Judah will demonstrate, that God who inhabits that temple, even though he transcends, the temple, is going to come to be enslaved or boxed in, is going to come to be a talisman, you might say, that upholds and legitimizes the reign of the empire, Solomon's empire, or all of the kings that come after Solomon dies and Israel splits into two kingdoms. This is the irony of all of this, that and I want us to keep this in mind as we're reading this, because eventually these are going to be the things that these two perspectives that Brueggemann is going to pit against each other. We've just talked about how this tradition, this prophetic tradition, arises out of the covenantal community of Moses and the people who call out to God and are freed from their oppression at the hands of Pharaoh. That would have happened around 1250 BCE. By 1000, or more specifically around 960 BCE, the Egypt that they had escaped from, with its triumphalism and its oppression of, the poor, had become Israel itself, with its triumphalism under King David, King Solomon, and its oppression of the poor. Remember what Samuel says to the people when they're calling for a king. Are you sure you want a king? Because, he's going to take your men, he's going to put them in the army, he's going to take your daughters, he's going to take a tenth of even more of what you're producing. No, no, we want a king. We want a king. The people hand over basically their freedom to the king, and out of the frying pan of Egypt and into the fire of King David's very triumphalistic kingdom. So these are the bookends within which Brueggemann is going to introduce the idea of what it means to be a prophet. And we, we're going to be, the emphasis is going to be on, trying to engender and to encourage in people a new alternative vision over against the vision of triumphalism, whether it's David's triumphalism, Pharaoh's triumphalism, or a kind of triumphalism that we see today in Christian nationalism, where God becomes a talisman, a legitimizer of the powers that be, of the status quo. This was the context in which Brueggemann was writing, and I think is even more poignant today in 2025. And he's asking ministers to be prophetic in their approach to ministry. Not just ministers, but he's asking ministers or pastors as, leaders of their church, in their leadership positions, to engender in their congregants an idea of what it means to be prophetic. And it could not be any more timely now than it was then. So as you're reading this, I always want to stop and see, because I had an insight that I can't introduce here, but when the time comes, I want to introduce the insight. I didn't have that insight when I was reading this book 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago. But I had it this time because of the context in which I'm reading. And then I can't introduce it now, it will require too much introduction. But when the time comes, I will. Have you had any of these types of aha moments when reading Brueggemann? Anybody?
It seems to me, Dan, that, he is writing in his mature years, I don't know how old he was when he wrote this book, but he's a child of Vietnam,
Right.
And post-Vietnam
Right.
was only, what, 4 years
Yeah.
before he publishes, the prophetic, uh, his book, The Prophetic Imagination.
Right. Right.
And how, like you're saying right now, how different the context has shifted, it seems to me, um, from where we were in 68 in the mid Carter years. And Jimmy Carter, had to be kind of in his thoughts as opposed to, trying to deal with where we are right now, which is pretty dark piece of American political history.
Yeah. And right. And all the more reason for us to read this book, just to be reminded, because, one of the things that empire does is it creates a uncritical populace who become, pretty much complacent in where they are and who they are, and they're not rewarded for any kind of critical thinking. Uh, but they basically just try to toe the line, not get caught up in the jaws of the machine itself. Uh, and it's a prophetic task in and of itself to to become critical, to criticize that which is oppressive, and to criticize the status quo, especially when that status quo is founded on oppression itself and the manipulation of those who are basically used as chess pieces, pawns in their game of triumphalism, I guess. So anyway, I want to get back to where we started. The task of prophetic ministry, of course, is to bring the claims of the tradition and the situation of enculturation, the church is enculturated and becoming complacent, into an effective interface. The prophet is called to be a child of the tradition, one who's taken it seriously in the shaping of his or her own field of perception, system of language. The task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. And that is, I think, the call of all great leaders, and we can see this, coming out of communities that are usually, have experienced some sort of grief, have experienced some sort of oppression, but they critique from that experience, but they can energize out of the hope that comes from the gospel message itself. And that is the alternative consciousness that we're talking about. Criticize the dominant consciousness, energize a consciousness of hope. And when we stopped last time, I mentioned to you a man by the name of Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was a prophetic leader in El Salvador in the 1970s. And if you remember at that time, I don't because I was a child, right? But after World War II, the concern was with the spread of communism. And one of the places that communism was going to enter into the United States was from the South, because you had a lot of these, communist movements, primarily in Cuba, right, that were on the rise. So the United States made a concerted effort to establish in places like, Nicaragua, El Salvador, uh, basically their own banana republics, so putting in place their own puppet rulers who were going to ensure that U.S. Uh, concerns and U.S. You know, what's the word I'm looking for? Interests, that U.S. interests were going to be maintained. But so here you are, you're creating a situation of imperialism, right? And triumphalism and the gods of the status quo, even though, we're not saying that, the God of Christianity is involved with this, but you do have a sense in which, you've got a dominant culture and a culture that is oppressed. So we have the whole Egypt experience kind of recapitulated here. Well, it was in the midst of this that people like Oscar Romero. And if we go to Nicaragua, a man by the name of Ernesto Cardenal brought the gospel message to the people, to the peasants who were experiencing that kind of that darkness of oppression. And I can think of, I'm introducing this to you because this rocked my socks off when I first saw it. And I was in seminary, and it brought home to me the notion of how people were living the gospel message that liberation theologians were trying to propose to the world, which is the message of an alternative consciousness. So your Ernesto Cardenal in Nicaragua or Oscar Romero in El Salvador, one of the things that Cardenal did is said, I'm working with this community in Salentaname. I want you, many of them were illiterate, right? Illiterate peasants. I want you to express in your own way your understanding of what it means to have this alternative consciousness. And so they create art. And there's a book called The Gospel in Art by the Peasants of Salentaname. And it's the whole story of Jesus and Jesus' teachings, Jesus being brought before Pilate, who, of course, is, Somoza, for example, in Nicaragua. He was one of the dictators there. Jesus being brought before Somoza, you can see this image here. It doesn't look like Jesus, does it? I mean, where's the robe? Where's the beard and everything? It's basically a man, a good man living in the Nicaraguan community. So you're already seeing how the story of of liberation is affecting people. Everyone's Jesus here. Everyone's being brought before Somoza. Here he is, and you see the crowds who are. Somoza had his supporters, but they're bringing Jesus, and of course, the charge would be insurrection, right? He's not supporting the powers that be. He's not supporting the status quo. And they continue on. In fact, they created a whole, 13 stations of the cross imagery that was used in Salentaname. And here's this Nicaraguan man, carrying his cross off to Golgotha. And this is one of the stations of the cross where he meets his mother, Mary. But we're not talking about Roman soldiers, right? We're talking about the FLN. I can't remember the acronym that was used. I mean, these are Somoza's soldiers, right? These are the keepers of the oppression. Jesus being crucified, Nicaragua, the story is very clear. The soldiers, the peasant women, and of course the Nicaraguan men have fled. Then the story of the resurrection. This is the story. This is hope that's brought. This is the energizing hope that's brought, that out of death comes a new life, finding the open tomb in the graveyard there in Salentaname among all of the crosses of people who have gone on before in this type of oppressive situation. So I wanted to introduce this to you because I think it's a good example of what prophetic ministry can do. It energizes the people out of hope, even in the midst of their darkness, to create a new understanding of who they are and how they fit into the gospel story, the narrative itself. And when I read this, I was in seminary, 24 years old or so. But up until that time, the Bible had been nothing but, quotations out of Galatians, right? Galatians says this, or, a quote out of Matthew, or a quote even out of the Old Testament. There's always little aphorisms that you were supposed to follow. But it was this idea of prophetic engagement that helped me to realize that, no, there's a narrative here. There's a story that I'm being called to be a part of. I'm being called to be a part of this, alternative consciousness. And it, like I said, it just knocked my socks off, and I've never been the same since. So, how do you feel about this? What are your thoughts? And this is the place where I thought, Denny, you would enjoy this, given your interest in Central America. Any thoughts?
I,
Ah,
I think it's an amazing, bringing up to, sort of modern time, um, the Jesus experience. And, I was teaching at Hastings College in international politics, and, Mac, I think you were, no, that was, as I say, that was before your time, but was it? No? Yeah,
1970.
yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Whoa.
but this, the emphasis on, uh, the Central American dictators and the U.S. involvement there, it really did not come to the fore in the United States until after the assassination of Oscar Romero, whose picture you just saw, who, very much like Thomas Becket was killed was assassinated while being, while serving the Eucharist. And it was such a blatant act of disregard and disrespect that it really took the world. And this is a way that a martyr comes to energize a new sense of hope, even in the midst of that darkness, right? And so I spent 1982, 3 months in Chiapas, Mexico, where there were a lot of the peasants were escaping from Guatemala, which was also another one of these countries that was being basically taken over by the U.S. and its puppet dictators, and was able to experience firsthand. I mean, these people were on the migrant road, this immigration road, which is so interesting because today the immigration that we see that's coming out of Central and South America is a result of our very presence in those countries, right? We create a situation that's intolerable for people who are poor and uneducated, and they look for a different life. And the place that they go is to the very place that creates the problem. And then we penalize them for it. And that's even a soft way of saying it. So anyway, I don't want to get off on that topic too much because we could talk about immigration all day. But I really wanted to share this with you because for some reason, this book, The Gospel in Art by the Peasants of Salentanami, has just fallen out of circulation. But it was one of the most powerful things I ever saw because, and when I first read The Prophetic Imagination, I said, this is exactly what was happening in El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua. At the time, there was a prophetic imagination that was being engendered uh, in the people, evoked, and and it created its own powerful movement. Any other thoughts on this? Well, we're 3 sessions into our book study, and we haven't even gotten to chapter 1. So I'm sorry I'm so so long-winded. But um, as I've already said, Brueggemann wants to make it clear that this prophetic tradition comes out of the original experience, the covenantal community of Moses. And I want to say right here, and I've got another slide, a few steps down that I want to mention this, but I'll just say it very briefly here. When we read the story in Exodus, the story of Moses, killing the Egyptian soldier, running off into the desert, having the experience of the burning bush, and then going back to Egypt with the message that God, wants Moses to help in letting his people go. First, it's, let's go out into the desert and worship our God. But then God wants to free this people from oppression in Egypt. These people at the time were known as Apiru, Hebrews. The word means dirty ones, kind of nasty ones, the people, who are worthless, throwaway in society. The idea that they were Israelites, that they had come from a long line of, descent from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and all the way through Joseph into, that is a story that's told about how they get into Egypt. But that story was most likely, this is our social scientific research coming into the equation, that story was most likely a story that was told after the fact. In fact, it was a story that was told by the first imperial triumphalist government of David and Solomon. Oh, we all had an ancestor named Abraham, and he had a son named Isaac and Jacob. The whole story of Genesis was created by a triumphalist monarchy. And this was the very thing that the people were trying to move away from trying to get away from in Egypt. So we have to remember that the experience of liberation is the source of the Hebrew nation, is the source of the Hebrew identity. That in the midst of their oppression, a God recognizes their oppression. And their experience is that with the help of this God, with the concern and the love, you might say, of this God, they are able to remove themselves from the bonds of their terrible experience. Eventually, they come into the land of Canaan. There they settle among, the various small little communities there. And they begin to tell their story about this God of freedom, this God who helped them escape. The story of the Exodus is a story that is developed over 200 years of telling. The splitting of the Red Sea, the wandering in the desert for 40 years, all of these magnificent, the giving of the Ten Commandments. This is a story that is eventually going to be written down 250 years after the fact. So what Brueggemann and many of the social scientists want us to focus on is one thing that we know for sure, one place in history that we know we have a foothold. We have archaeological evidence that somewhere around the time of the 13th century BCE, there was a group known as the Apiru, the Hebrew, and they were enslaved in Egypt. We have conjectured that it was under Ramses II, who was, involved in all kinds of great building projects there. And in the midst of that experience, there were a group of people, not 300,000 as Exodus says, and that's 300,000 men. If you add to that, let's say another, 100,000 women if they were married, and add some children to that, you've got 500,000 to 1 million people wandering in the desert of Sinai. That never happened. It's just inconceivable that that could happen. But what did happen was the experience of liberation, the experience of the gods of Egypt who had all the power over the people in bondage were somehow thwarted by this God that they felt was on their side. That's the story that's being told, the story of liberation. And so the two ends of the equation are drawn up. The gods of Egypt and the God of Israel. And it's Moses' covenantal tradition that makes a radical break from Egypt. And Brueggemann makes the point that we have no indication that this tradition was formed in any kind of sociological way, right? We can't attribute it to factors that were happening culturally that created this community. Brueggemann, and I think there are going to be some people who would probably challenge that. But Brueggemann wants to make the tradition that this community was founded and it was formed from the inside. It was formed as a result of a revelation that they had, and an existential experience, you might say. And he makes the really interesting claim, and we'll unpack this a little later, that this is the beginning of history. This is the beginning of history. So we have to ask him, well, what do you mean by history? But we'll touch on that when the time comes. But that break is with Egypt's static triumphalism, where the gods, he calls them the lords of order, they are the ones who legitimize the status quo, right? And if you think about the status quo, the reason it is the status quo, is it's the way things are supposed to be. That is the assumption. And in Egypt, the religious priests and all of the people who are involved with the cult of Egypt wanted to maintain that status quo. In the ancient Near East at this time, from the time of the Epic of Gilgamesh all the way up to what we're talking about here, people didn't want something new. We live in a culture where we want new and improved, and new marketing is always about this is new, and I've always got to try to figure out how to do new software that's improved. Well, at that time, something new was a threat because it meant that the status quo was not being maintained. And so what they wanted to do, what the priests were in charge of, was ensuring that time would remain completely cyclical, right? The spring would come, the Nile would flood, our agriculture would commence, the harvest would come, and then that whole cycle would repeat again. We wanted some sort of maintenance of what was manageable and what was predictable, right? So something new utterly upsets the equation. So it's a constant, eternal return of the same. That is what the status quo represents. And the status quo, of course, is maintained by a aristocratic class, maybe the 10%, a military class, right, who ensures that, the peasant class, who are largely slaves, brought from cultures that had been conquered, do the work of maintaining the status quo through architecture, through creating, through building the pyramids, through, harvesting the food. They maintained the status quo. And it was going to be this status quo that Moses himself, with this revelation that he would have, would completely upset. Now, as I was reading this, I wanted to, I didn't know if this would interrupt things too much, but there's a book that I've been recently trying to reacquaint myself with, and it's called The Open Society and Its Enemies. Have you ever heard of this? This was written by a philosopher named Karl Popper. And Karl Popper basically is one of the people who upset all of the philosophers who were, the line in philosophy is that all of philosophical history is just a series of footnotes on Plato, right? Popper was the one that said, look, if you want to look for the foundation of totalitarianism, you look to Plato. If you read the Republic, you'll see very clearly that Plato not only conceives of, but justifies a hierarchically arranged society where the philosopher kings, the smart people at the top, are the ones who have access to the truth, and they have to maintain, the goings on of everybody beneath them, as is only right, because they're the smart ones, right? Well, that is exactly what we're talking about with, the Egyptians here, except it's the the Pharaoh has access to the gods of Egypt, right? And the religious have access to the gods of Egypt. It's not the philosopher kings, as it was with Plato, who have access to the world of forms and ideas, but it's roughly the same thing. And so when Popper made this assertion, I think this book came out around the 1960s or so. It just took the world by fire. He was never a very popular philosopher for that very reason. He was a philosopher of science who is really responsible for honing the critical scientific method to what it is today. So Denny, I saw you nodding your head. Do you have any thoughts on Popper and Egypt in this?
Oh, I just recall in grad school, um, reading Karl Popper.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, I'd have to stretch a bit, to pull those notes back, but it was it was a very, very impressive uh, piece of writing in the early 1960s for me in
yeah,
grad school.
right. And that would have been about the time this came out. Now, one of the reasons I bring up Popper is because you may have heard of the Open Society in another context. Uh, the Open Society is George Soros's foundation that gives money to democratic movements, right? Of course, gives money to people who go out and protest against Donald Trump. We all know. I'm joking about that. But George Soros was a student of Karl Popper and insanely committed to the idea of democratic society and democracy, freedom, uh, freedom that is unhindered by any kind of, well, what we're calling triumphalism here. Karl Popper comes out of a history. He was spent a lot of his time in New Zealand during World War II, but where totalitarianism was really what needed to be philosophically undermined. And thus, that's what he's trying to do in the Open Society. He challenges Plato, and then in Volume 2, he challenges Hegel as well as Marx. And thus, in so doing, establishes a philosophy of, you know, democracy, and a justification for democracy. But this notion of freedom is also something that Brueggemann is going to focus on because over against the triumphalism of Egypt, with its gods who maintain the status quo, we have, by contrast, a God whose very identity rests in freedom. Now, this is something that is really interesting to think about because you often think about the gods as being, completely free to do whatever they want. But in the way that Egypt maintained its status quo, the gods were just as enslaved to Egypt as Egypt was to the gods. Speaking of Hegel, this is a kind of a principle that he talked about is that the master and slave have a relationship that's really codependent in that respect. These are gods who are enslaved. They can't just pick up and go someplace else. As I'm talking about as we understand it socially, right? These gods were going to maintain the status quo. Introduce into that a God of freedom who will not be enslaved, who will do the surprising thing, who will do the thing that causes that whole cyclical system that we were just talking about to get upset, right? Who will do the new thing. This is when history begins, says Brueggemann. What does he mean by that? In a system like Egypt's, where the time just is cyclical and goes over and over, there is no need to say on this certain date we did this or whatever. But when God introduces the idea of freedom into that cycle and says, you people go and follow me, and I will show you to the place you need to go, all of a sudden, God's freedom is imposed on, if you will, is at least, or at least offered to human beings. And it is at that point that human freedom comes to be acknowledged as a thing, as something that they, that they have access to. And when human freedom is acknowledged, then we can begin to mark the plan of God by how human actions move towards that objective, right? On such and such a date, we did this, and then and then God helped us in this way and helped us in this way. And all of a sudden, cyclical time becomes linear time. Cyclical time, which is the time under which Egypt, lived, becomes linear. You have a people who are free as a result of a God who frees them. And this is a story that has not been, whose ending has not been written yet, just as history's ending has not been written yet. So this is what Brueggemann means by history really begins with the grievance that people posit against the Egyptian triumphalism. And because God is a God who's free, and this people is created in the image of that God, then the system of oppression and violence that Egypt once experienced, that Egypt was, experienced daily, now becomes a situation of justice and compassion. God's freedom and human freedom give way to a system of justice and compassion. And this is what, we'll be talking a little bit more about this as Brueggemann's book moves on. So let me read what I wanted to read here on page 9 and 10. If a God is disclosed who is free to come and go, I'm on actually, this is on page 8, about a third of the way down on the page. If a God is disclosed who is free to come and go, free from and even against the regime, free to hear and even answer slave cries, free from all proper godness as defined by the empire. I love that. Free from all proper godness as defined by the empire, right? Then it will bear decisively upon sociology, because the freedom of God will surface in the brickyards and manifest itself as justice and compassion. That which was not possible under the empire now becomes possible. Human beings having freedom, and that is justice. And an ability to understand others, ability to stand apart from the lack of freedom, stand apart from the slavery, and recognize that others are experiencing what they had once experienced. And that gives rise to the compassion there. I'm going to keep reading on down about 4 lines up on page 8. Here it is enough to insist that Moses, paradigm for prophet, so it's going to be Moses that all of the prophets are going to model themselves after, carry the alternative in both directions, a religion of God's freedom as alternative to the state imperial religion of order and triumph, and a politics of justice and compassion as an alternative to the imperial politics of oppression. So on the one hand, now you have the two sides are clearly drawn, a religion of freedom and versus a religion of empire, then a religion of politics and justice versus a politics of oppression. The point that prophetic imagination must ponder is that there is no freedom of God without the politics of justice and compassion. And there is no politics of justice and compassion without the religion of the freedom of God. So if we know that this religion of the freedom of God is moving toward an empire, David's empire, that looks very much like Egypt's empire, then we can pretty clearly see that David's empire is probably not going to be founded on a religion of justice and compassion, but on a religion of oppression. And this is one of the reasons that Brueggemann took a lot of heat when he wrote this book, because there are factions among theologians that really want to emphasize the importance of an empire of God's people that is chosen and blessed by God. But then what comes along with that is all of the oppression that comes along with an empire. For that reason, there are many people who say, let's got to get rid of that, you know? This is contrary to what God wanted in the beginning. This is the reason that God brought people out of Egypt, so they didn't have to be under such a regime. But that's where we are. Any comments about this or thoughts? I want, if not, I want to just give you a very brief review for some of you on how it is that we're reading these documents. We have a tendency to think that these documents are history written by people that were, following along in context, right? But as I said earlier, the experience is the beginning. And that experience would come to take narrative form, first of all, in oral sources, people telling the story around the campfire, right? My grandfather told the story of his escape from Egypt, and it was at the hands of this wonderful God of freedom that gave him his freedom, you know. But eventually, those stories come to be written in the context of the people for whom writing stories can take on a manipulative purpose, right? The first stories come to be written during Solomon's empire. And so anytime you have an empire who wants to maintain its imperial perspective, you have to create a narrative that the people are all going to recognize as valid. That empire, of course, Solomon's empire, was going to fall apart at the death of Solomon. And there would be 10 tribes who would come to take on their own sense of identity. And they would create a narrative as well. And so when we read the story of the Egyptian exodus, the exodus from Egypt, I should say, what we're getting is a story that was written 200 to 300 years after the fact. So the question we always have to ask is, what is the intent of the people writing this? This was recognized as late as the 19th century, around 1883, with a man by the name of Julian Wellhausen, who, when he was reading the Old Testament, recognized, hey, there seem to be a couple of traditions here that have all been kind of edited together. And the way he knew that is because when he read Genesis, he saw that there were times when you would have whole sections of a narrative that referred to God as Yahweh. But then it would pass over into sections where God would be referred to as Elohim. And so what we have really when we read the story we see in Genesis and the story we see in Exodus, we have two different narratives, and one of those is it's a narrative written by empire with an empire identity, and that's called the Yahwist narrative. And the other narrative is one that maintains the slave identity as well, and that's known as the Elohist narrative. And so the whole of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, was probably written over about a 500-year period of time. And, in different contexts, we know that the Yahwist tradition written under Solomon was probably written around, the late 9th century, late 922 BCE. I can't go backwards in my mind. The late 10th century. And the Elohist narrative was written about 100 years later. So if you wanted to, and the reason I'm saying this is because we can't just simply read the narrative as history. We have to recognize in there that there's a slave narrative as well as an imperial narrative, right? But if you were to color code just the Yahwist and the Elohist tradition, there would be other traditions like the Deuteronomist and the priestly that would come later. But in the early centuries of the people that we know of as Israel, the 10 tribes, and Judah in the south, the 2 tribes. Here's what that tradition looks like. If we were to color code the Yahwist tradition, we see written primarily in Genesis. This was the tradition that was written by Solomon, right? Now there's a later tradition that's going to add called the priestly tradition. Up here you can see the color coding. The priestly tradition written in the 5th century are going to add their little amendments, you might say, to the Genesis story. But you can see that there's this red color and there's this green color. You have the imperial tradition written by the Yahwists under Solomon's reign. Then you have what you might say is the slave memory written under the Elohist name here. And so you have in Genesis what we might call a dueling perspective. And what is ironically the very perspective that Brueggemann is talking about, an imperialist tradition on the one hand, and a slave narrative that speaks of God's freedom and justice on the other hand. Both of these are present in the very inception of the people of Israel. When we get to Exodus, though, you will see that the Yahwist tradition kind of drops out. In the first couple of chapters, you might say, you have reference to Yahweh, but most of Exodus that we're reading, and remember, Exodus is the people being pulled out of Egypt, being drawn out of Egypt, wandering in the desert, receiving the covenant, and ending with Moses about to go into the promised land. That story is going to be built upon in Leviticus and Numbers and definitely Deuteronomy, which is not here for a reason we won't go into. But Exodus is primarily written by the Elohists, the people who try to maintain this idea of God as a liberator. So I think it is kind of interesting that this very dichotomy that we're talking about, the triumphalist narrative as well as the peace and justice narrative, or justice and compassion narrative, are found within the very first book of the Torah itself. I'm probably going to be coming back to this quite a bit as we talk about the first couple of chapters of this book. But are there any questions about this? You must understand that the first 5 books of the Bible are put together almost like a family, what do they call the scrapbook, right? And you have different writers that are being, offering their narrative in different times. It would eventually come to be put together by an editor late in the 4th century BCE. All of these different traditions would be put together, and this is what we know of as the Torah and the historical books of the Old Testament. But the Exodus narrative itself has a lot of emphasis upon the God who is concerned about the slaves and the underlings, those who experienced freedom, in Egypt. Any thoughts about this?
Yeah, Dan, very briefly, another thing that kind of adds to, I think, a lot of the common readers' confusion over this is just the order that the books are presented. It's Genesis, Exodus. Well, actually, if you wanted to be logical about it, it should
Right.
be Exodus, Genesis, because Exodus is the formative, seminal, historical event in the creation
Yeah,
of Israel. And, if you didn't have Exodus, you wouldn't have an Old Testament.
exactly. I mean, that's a very succinct way to put all my wordiness into a single sentence. The beginning of the story is the experience that is told in Exodus. The pre-story, you might say, doesn't come around until King Solomon's day, and doesn't come around till 100 years after Solomon when the Elohists add to that story. If you look at Genesis, the the emphasis upon Abraham and Isaac is a Yahwist emphasis. The emphasis on Jacob is the Elohist emphasis. So all of these pieces coming together, but your point is precisely what we need to talk about, because this is what Brueggemann wants to say. The experience of freedom that comes from a God of freedom, removing the slaves out of Egypt, is where the prophetic tradition begins. The experience of a God of freedom taking a people in bondage into freedom is where the prophetic imagination begins. And this is where we're going to keep coming back to this Exodus story. Thank you, Mac, for summarizing in a single sentence what I've spent 45 minutes talking about. That's me. I'm sorry, guys, if I'm too wordy. I really am. So anyway, any other thoughts on this before we move on? Karen, nice to see you. Karen didn't recognize that you were here. Okay. All right. Well, a lot of stuff to go over today. We're still in chapter 1 of this book. And when we come back, I can't remember what I've got coming up next. Nope. Well, we'll look at the prophetic criticism that's where we'll pick up around page 12. So thank you, everybody. Sharon was trying to get in, but I didn't see her. So
She's there.
oh, there you are, Sharon. Okay, good. Sorry. All right. Well,
Dan,
goodbye, everybody. Thank you
Dan,
for
I
your
just want-
patience. I'll see you next time.